Let's explore what unconscious bias is. You may have also heard other terms like implicit bias or cognitive bias or implicit associations used to describe this. These terms have similar meanings and are sometimes used interchangeably. Something important you should know about our brains is how they interpret new information. I'd like to introduce you to the amygdala. It's a tiny part of the brain right about here. Simply put, the amygdala is responsible for the emotional processing of information, for emotional memory. Now, all the information the brain receives is first processed here in the amygdala. This means that what is seen to be normal, how our biases are formed, is processed largely as an emotional response. We use our emotions, or the emotions we experienced in the past, in similar situations, to process new information and new experiences. We react from emotion or instinct without questioning where that emotion or instinct comes from. If we're lucky, the information moves out of the amygdala, and we make sense of it in another way. But that doesn't always happen. Remember that bias is a shortcut. As a society, as Canadians, we're not used to challenging our sense of identity. We often don't question those responses. Canada is diverse, accepting, multicultural, and tolerant of diversity. Canadians are rarely asked to explore our biases because we are incorrectly taught that we don't or shouldn't have any. The beautiful thing about the brain is that it's malleable. It's capable of learning, unlearning, relearning if we're willing. It's possible to make a conscious and deliberate shift away from unconsciousness to a more deliberate, critical, responsive, and accountable way of being and doing. This is so important in equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Wouldn't you agree? When people first start learning about unconscious bias, they often invite some trainers in. Trainers love to tell you that there are all kinds of unconscious biases. In fact, there could be upwards of 150 different kinds of unconscious bias. And these training sessions typically invite participants to do some activities that hopefully create some kind of personal epiphany, an aha moment. Participants will have some kind of reaction and it'll come into their consciousness that they have bias. The trouble with these kinds of sessions is that sometimes they can backfire. Trainers and facilitators intend to create an aha or epiphany moment, but sometimes these are actually perceived more as gotcha moments, as traps. This happens when people are already skeptical or uncomfortable about the idea of bias, so the facilitators are treated like the magicians of the training world. Instead of being transformative, the aha moments are really illusions, the traps that the magician has set up for you. Here's an example. Maybe you've done this exercise before. In an average training session, half the participants might be given this resume and asked if they would likely hire this person, and the vast majority say yes. The other half of the room is given this resume, and they all overwhelmingly say no, they would not hire this person. Of course, it's the same resume. The exercise is designed to reveal one of the 150 different kinds of biases, and some people really enjoy this experience. But others feel trapped by it. They struggle to connect the exercise to their own behaviors or to the very real issues of racism or sexism or homophobia, and they struggle to see what any of this has to do with them. Many people dig in against this kind of training, and they become defensive. They cling fast to their previously held beliefs. They believe even more firmly in the status quo and even less in the hocus pocus of unconscious bias. And as you might expect, although unconscious bias is a hard conversation for everyone, it sometimes seems to be even harder for people who have power, who are part of the dominant normal, who grew up in or were shaped by the status quo. These people don't often experience marginalization, and this makes it much harder for them to address equity and inclusion. That's not to say that you personally or your organization should shy away from training, but you should also seek out the kinds of learnings and experiences that nurture these skills and don't alienate others. Learning about unconscious bias is almost always a personal experience first, which makes it challenging but not impossible from an organizational standpoint. How can you facilitate willingness to engage in uncomfortable and difficult unlearning and relearning? In personal transformation, what kind of personal and organizational leadership currently exists? Is there psychological safety to do this very personal kind of work? And how do you find your own compass? Pause and reflect. What kind of personal learning would you want to pursue to help you learn more about unconscious bias and your own unconscious biases? Imagine that your company is interested in pursuing unconscious bias training. What advice would you give?